I think my talk in your program is called The Challenges We Face, Why We Need an Independent Jewish Canadian Movement, which is a fine title, but I'd like to change it to Israel, whatever you do, don't act normal. I'm going to get to that, but I do want to start by addressing that question of why we do so urgently need an independent Jewish movement and voice in this country. I think it's that Diana just alluded to it. It has to do with how Canada has, with very little debate, been drawn into the paradigm of the so-called war on terror. It's an extraordinarily dangerous paradigm, which essentially holds that the West is at war against the Arab and Muslim worlds, sometimes called Islamofascism. It's a war that isn't designed to end. It can't end because we are up against supposedly an enemy that doesn't have any coherent goals at all, but wants only to eliminate our freedom, our way of life, and seeks only our destruction. So a war like this cannot end. And for the first few years of this so-called war on terror, declared by the Bush administration, Canada did sit somewhat to the sidelines, although not quite as much to the sidelines as perhaps Jean Chrétien wanted us to think. But we did hold back. We did hold back, much to the chagrin of the Bush administration. And what we really are seeing in these past few years, and particularly since the Harper government came to power, is a dramatic shift and a full-scale embrace of this model, of this very dangerous, belligerent model. And we see it on multi-fronts. But I think it's important for us to understand that the war on terror, clash of civilizations paradigm really comes from two sources. It comes from the United States, which, as I try to document in my book, in The Shock Doctrine, you have a government that is run by interests that have a vested interest in endless war, for whom the end of the Cold War was the worst thing that ever happened to them, and have been looking for an enemy that would fuel that kind of endless war to keep their coffers full. And this is what I mean by the disaster capitalism complex. That's who runs the Bush administration. And it is precisely the never-ending quality of the war on terror that makes it so attractive from a business perspective, that it simply can't end because you have this incoherent, belligerent enemy. But this paradigm also comes from Israel. And what we saw after September 11th was an immediate move by the Israeli government to cast 9/11 as part of the war that Israel had been fighting, and to recast a war over territory, a war against nationalist forces in Israel as part of this global war against incoherent Islamic masses. And this was very clearly in Israel's interest to recast the concept, the conflict in this way. So Canada's signing on to this paradigm, we can see on multiple levels. I think we can see it very clearly in Afghanistan, and this idea that we are there in a war without end, cast in by this government in classic clash of civilization terms. And as part of that, we see a creeping and dangerous normalization of torture coming from, in a country that just a few years ago prided itself as a human rights leader on the international stage. So as part of being part of that paradigm, it changes us as a culture. It changes our values. And of course, this is the ultimate irony of the Israeli talking point, that we are part of a paradigm of shared values. Because of course, this clash of civilization model has a corrosive effect on our values, the values that we hold dear of democracy and human rights. We also, I believe, see Canada's signing on to the war on terror model in our government's silent complicity on the ongoing horrors in Iraq, the presence of Canadian oil companies taking advantage of that carnage. And I think we also see it here at home with the Security and Prosperity Partnership and the creeping integration of our border and security apparatus with the United States. But most glaringly, we see it in the Harper government's blind support for an ever more belligerent Israeli state. Now, the key turning point was I believe, when the Harper government in March 2006 raced to make Canada the first of Israel's allies to punish the Palestinian people for daring to democratically elect Hamas. Emboldened, Israel went on the offensive, inflicting textbook collective punishment, which I won't go into in detail here, but it has been on the offensive ever since. Now, that was March 2006, and next up was Canada's wholesale support of Israel's attacks on Lebanon that same summer, August 2006. And here what we saw was a powerful convergence between Canada's Israel lobby, party politics, particularly Tory party politics, but also Liberal party politics, and the corporate media. And what that meant was that the Harper government's position, which was actually a very contentious position, was barely debated in the corporate media, and certainly not within the ASPR-controlled media, which in some markets holds a near monopoly control, certainly over print, virtually over TV, and really positioned itself as an unapologetic arm of the lobby. So you saw that convergence between the party and the media. And then we also saw Heather Reisman and Jerry Schwartz rewarding the Tories by leading an exodus from the Liberals to the Harper Tories, explicitly because of their stand on Israel's attack on Lebanon. Now, I want to be clear, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about Heather Reisman and Jerry Schwartz in my talk tonight, that I believe that everybody has a right to their political opinions, including Jerry Schwartz and Heather Reisman and the Asper family. But what we saw that summer was really about the dangers of corporate consolidation. And I think when many of us raised the alarm about media consolidation, about ownership, the alarming consolidation, the ownership of the book industry in this country, the fact that Chapters Indigo merged and control 80% of the book selling business in many parts of the country. This was a largely theoretical debate. But what we saw that summer was how frightening it was when all of these forces line up on an issue that actually doesn't represent the views of the majority of the people in Canada. That's when it becomes a threat to democracy. And that's when a few individuals really start exerting an unacceptable level of control over public debate in a democracy. So in that summer of 2006, I think it would have been very, very good to have an umbrella organization like the one we're talking about here this weekend, representing the broad range of dissenting Jewish opinion in Canada. It would have been very important as a counterweight to this illusion of consent that actually didn't exist, but was projected from the official lobby groups and from the corporate media. And it also would have been very, very important because that shift, I think, was extremely jarring for Arab and Muslim Canadians who suddenly weren't sure whether they had full citizenship status in this country. And it would have been very important to have a group that was standing in meaningful solidarity with Muslim Arab Canadians that terrible summer. It is just as important to have a group like this year.